Harper Lane always arrived early, because being useful kept her steady. Thanksgiving at Marlene Lane House looked warm, yet it felt tense under the smiles. The kitchen smelled like butter, sage, and roasted apples, and the dining room filled quickly. More than 30 people crowded in, cousins, neighbors, and church friends, talking louder than normal. Harper washed dishes, set out plates, and nodded through small comments that stung. She learned to keep her expression calm, even when her stomach tightened. Derek Lane started pouring whiskey before the turkey was carved, and the air shifted. He sat at the head of the table, shoulders rigid, jaw tight, eyes narrowed. Sloane Lane stayed close beside him, touching his arm at strange moments, like she was guiding him. Kinsley Lane floated between guests, polished and sweet, collecting praise without trying. Harper tried to focus on Marlene Lane, who moved slower this year, yet noticed everything. When Travis Lane asked about work, Harper answered politely and left out the promotion. She knew her wins could become someone else's reason to cut her down. The turkey finally hit the table, and plates began to clink and pass. Laughter rose. Someone complimented Marlene Lane cooking, and for a moment it felt normal. Derek Lane lifted his glass, and Harper expected a harmless toast. Instead, he stared at her, and his voice cut through the room. He said, Harper was so independent because she was not really family. A few people laughed, thinking it was a rough joke, and the laughter faded fast. Travis Lane asked what Derek Lane meant, and Derek Lane did not blink. He said he was done pretending, and he said Harper was not his daughter. Forks stopped in midair, and silence spread like a cold spill. Harper felt heat rush into her face, and her chest tightened like a fist. Marlene Lane's hand trembled against her napkin, and her eyes filled with pain. Sloane Lane lowered her gaze, too calm, as if she expected this moment. Kinsley Lane stared at Harper for a beat, then looked away quickly. Harper tried to speak, and her throat refused to cooperate. Shame has weight, and it pins you to your chair. She heard her own heartbeat, and the soft scrape of someone shifting. Every gaze seemed to wait for her to fall apart, right there at the table. Harper swallowed hard and forced one slow breath, because she knew this was only the beginning. Harper Lane could not tell if her hands were shaking, or if the whole room was trembling. Derek Lane stayed on his feet, glass still raised, like he needed everyone to see him as the judge. The silence turned heavy, and Harper could hear the faint tick of the kitchen clock. Travis Lane told Derek Lane to stop, and his voice sounded sharp, almost desperate. Marlene Lane, whispered Derek's name again, and it came out like a warning. Sloane Lane sat close beside Derek Lane, smooth and quiet, as if she was watching a plan unfold. Kinsley Lane stared at her plate, then glanced past Harper Lane, refusing to meet her eyes. Someone at the far end tried to laugh, and it died in their throat. Harper Lane felt her face burn, and she hated that her body was giving her away. She wanted to ask what proof Derek Lane had, yet she could not form the words. Derek Lane leaned forward and scanned the table as if he wanted witnesses to sign off on his claim. He said he was tired of playing along, and he said the truth mattered more than comfort. Harper Lane watched relatives look down and watched strangers stare like they had paid for a show. A woman murmured a prayer, and a man cleared his throat. Marlene Lane pressed her napkin to her mouth, and her knuckles turned pale. Travis Lane looked ready to lunge, his jaw working with anger. Harper Lane tried to breathe evenly, but the air felt thick like smoke. She told herself not to cry, not here, not in front of them. Yet humiliation does not ask permission. It settles on you and makes you small. Sloane Lane finally spoke in a soft voice and told everyone to calm down. The softness made Harper Lane feel worse, because it sounded practiced, like a line she had waited to use. Harper Lane looked at Derek Lane again, and saw no doubt, no hesitation, only a hard certainty. In that moment, Harper Lane understood he wanted her to shrink, and he wanted the table to agree. He wanted her to feel alone, and he wanted her to disappear from the story they told about their family. Derek Lane kept talking, and each sentence felt like a stone thrown at Harper Lane. He said he should have known years ago, and he said Marlene Lane hid the truth. He dragged Harper Lane's mother into the room, even though she was not there to defend herself. He called her dishonest, and said the dates never lined up, and said people whispered behind his back. Harper Lane felt dizzy, because he was putting a dead woman on trial at a holiday table. Travis Lane demanded Derek Lane explain himself, and asked where this story came from. Derek Lane pointed at Harper Lane, like she was a piece of evidence, not a person. He said he spent years paying bills, raising a child who was not his blood, and he said he deserved answers. He said he deserved respect, and he said everyone should stop protecting Harper Lane. Harper Lane tried to speak, and her voice shook. She said she did not know what he was talking about, and she said her mother loved him. Marlene Lane lifted her head, and anger flashed in her eyes. She told Derek Lane he was cruel, and she told him he was wrong. Derek Lane snapped back and said, Marlene Lane always covered for Harper Lane. Like that was a crime. Sloane Lane watched the exchange, expression smooth, almost pleased. Kinsley Lane glanced at Sloane Lane for a second, then dropped her gaze, and Harper Lane noticed. That small look sent a chill through Harper Lane, because it felt like a signal. Derek Lane kept talking, and said the family needed to face reality. His words hung over the table, heavy and poisonous. Harper Lane realized this was not only about blood, it was about control, and about pushing her out so someone else could take her place. Travis Lane told Derek Lane to sit down, and Derek Lane refused, as if standing made him stronger. Marlene Lane's hands trembled, and Harper Lane felt her own fingers go numb. She swallowed hard, and told herself she would not break in front of them, not while they tried to erase her. Harper Lane pushed her chair back, and the scrape cut through the silence. Every head turned, and the whole table seemed to hold one long breath. She stood up slowly, and forced her shoulders to stay square. She looked at Derek Lane, and said he could be angry, but he could not rewrite her life with one cruel sentence. She said she was not a rumor, and she was not a mistake. Derek Lane gave a short, bitter sound, and his eyes stayed cold. Harper Lane turned to Marlene Lane, and saw tears shining there. Marlene Lane reached out, and Harper Lane took her hand, squeezing like she needed proof she was still real. Travis Lane stood too, stepping closer, like he would not let Harper Lane face this alone. Sloane Lane finally lifted her eyes, and her gaze measured Harper Lane, like a problem to solve. Kinsley Lane stared at Harper Lane for a moment, then looked away, and Harper Lane felt the sting of that choice. She stored it in the back of her mind because she would need every detail later. Harper Lane told the room that her mother deserved better than this, and she would not let anyone drag her name for entertainment. Her voice steadied as she spoke, and the steadiness surprised her. She said if Derek Lane wanted to hate her, he could do it without an audience. She said she would not beg for a seat at a table where she was treated like a stranger. Marlene Lane whispered for her to stay, and Harper Lane almost did. Then she saw Derek Lane's mouth tighten, like he expected her to fold, like he wanted her to plead. That was the moment Harper Lane chose herself. She turned away from the table and walked through the hallway without running. Behind her, the room stayed hushed, as if everyone was afraid to move. When she opened the front door, cold air hit her face, sharp and clean. She stepped onto the porch and finally drew a full breath. She stared into the dark yard and promised herself she would come back with the truth, and she would not come back alone. Harper Lane stood on the porch and hugged her arms tight. The cold air cleared her head, yet it did not calm her chest. Inside, she heard muffled voices, then a chair scraping hard. The front door opened, and Travis Lane stepped out, moving fast. He asked if she was okay, and Harper Lane almost laughed at the question. She said she could not breathe in that house, not with Derek Lane staring like that. Travis Lane said Derek Lane crossed a line and he should never have done it in front of everyone. Harper Lane swallowed and said it felt planned, like someone set the table for her humiliation. Travis Lane looked toward the windows, then back at her, and he did not argue. He said Sloane Lane had been stirring Derek Lane for months, planting doubts, feeding his temper. Harper Lane felt her stomach drop, because the idea fit too well. She asked why, and Travis Lane said Sloane Lane wanted the family to revolve around her and Kinsley Lane. Harper Lane heard the name Kinsley Lane and remembered that quick look at the table. Travis Lane told Harper Lane to come with him, just to sit in the car, just to warm up. Harper Lane shook her head and said she did not want to be hidden away like a problem. The door opened again, softer this time, and Marlene Lane appeared. Her eyes were wet, and her hands trembled, yet her voice held. She told Harper Lane she was sorry, and she told her to come inside because she belonged there. Harper Lane looked at Marlene Lane, and the hurt in Marlene Lane's face made her throat tighten. Harper Lane said she could not stay tonight, not after what Derek Lane did. Marlene Lane nodded and said she understood, but she asked Harper Lane to meet her the next morning. She said there were things Harper Lane needed to know, and she said she should have said them sooner. Harper Lane listened and felt a small spark of strength return. She agreed, and Travis Lane offered to drive her home. Harper Lane took one last look at the warm windows, and she let herself walk away. The car was quiet at first, except for the heater blowing. Travis Lane kept both hands on the wheel, and his knuckles stayed tight. Harper Lane stared out at the dark streets and tried to steady her breathing. After a few blocks, Travis Lane said Derek Lane had not always been like this. He said Derek Lane used to be proud of Harper Lane, even when he did not say it well. Harper Lane answered that pride did not excuse cruelty, and Travis Lane agreed. He said the change started after Sloane Lane moved in, and after she learned how the family money worked. Harper Lane asked what he meant, and Travis Lane said Marlene Lane house was the center of everything. He said it was not just a home, it was security, and it was leverage. Harper Lane felt her skin prickle because it sounded like a motive. Travis Lane, said Sloane Lane, talked about fairness, yet she always meant her own fairness. He said Kinsley Lane was treated like a guest at first, and Sloane Lane hated that. Harper Lane remembered Kinsley Lane collecting compliments, and she felt sick. Travis Lane said he overheard fights late at night, Derek Lane accusing Marlene Lane of favoritism. He said Sloane Lane would cry, then whisper, then calm Derek Lane down. Harper Lane asked if Travis Lane believed Derek Lane words, and Travis Lane said no. He said Harper Lane looked like Derek Lane, and he said Marlene Lane would never lie about something like that. Harper Lane tried to hold on to that, yet doubt still clawed at her. Doubt was the weapon Derek Lane threw, and it landed. Travis Lane pulled up to Harper Lane Place, and he did not leave right away. He told Harper Lane that Marlene Lane was not asking to meet for comfort. He said Marlene Lane sounded afraid, like she was racing time. Harper Lane asked what that meant, and Travis Lane said he did not know, but he trusted Marlene Lane instincts. Harper Lane stepped out, and the night air hit again. Travis Lane told her to lock her door and to call if she needed anything. Harper Lane nodded and watched his car disappear. Then she went inside and tried not to fall apart. Harper Lane did not sleep. She only drifted in and out. Her phone buzzed near midnight, and her heart jumped hard. The screen showed Marlene Lane, and Harper Lane answered at once. Marlene Lane sounded small and tired, and angry all at the same time. She said Derek Lane was still downstairs, still drinking, still shouting about betrayal. She said Sloane Lane was pretending to calm him, but she was smiling when she thought no one could see. Harper Lane closed her eyes and felt her jaw clench. Marlene Lane told Harper Lane she needed to hear something clearly. She said Harper Lane mother was faithful, and she said there was proof, real proof, saved for years. Harper Lane sat up and asked what kind of proof. Marlene Lane told her there was paperwork and letters and a test that Derek Lane could not argue with. Harper Lane asked why it was hidden, and Marlene Lane paused. She said she wanted to protect Harper Lane's childhood, and she said she hoped Derek Lane would grow up. Harper Lane felt tears sting, not from weakness, but from rage. She said Derek Lane did this to her in front of strangers, and he did not care. Marlene Lane agreed, and her voice sharpened. She said Sloane Lane pushed for this moment because she thought it would break Harper Lane and make her leave for good. Harper Lane said she would not disappear, and Marlene Lane said good. She told Harper Lane to come early in the morning, before Sloane Lane was awake, before Derek Lane started drinking again. She said they would talk privately, and she would show Harper Lane everything. Harper Lane promised she would come, and Marlene Lane whispered that she loved her. Harper Lane held the phone close and said she loved her too. When the call ended, Harper Lane sat in the dark, and her fear turned into focus. She did not know what the proof was yet, but she knew one thing. She was done being quiet, and she was done letting others define her. Harper Lane drove back before sunrise, and the streets were empty. She parked 2 houses away and walked quietly, breathing fog into cold air. The porch light at Marlene Lane house was on, like a signal. Harper Lane knocked once, then waited, and the door opened fast. Marlene Lane pulled her inside and held her for a long second. The hug felt fragile, yet it also felt steady. Marlene Lane led her straight to the kitchen and set a kettle on the stove. The house was quiet, but it did not feel safe. Harper Lane asked where Derek Lane was, and Marlene Lane said he fell asleep in the living room. Harper Lane asked about Sloane Lane, and Marlene Lane said she was still upstairs, pretending everything was normal. Marlene Lane kept her voice low, and her eyes stayed sharp. She told Harper Lane they did not have much time. Harper Lane sat at the table, hands clasped, trying to keep them from shaking. Marlene Lane reached into a cabinet and pulled out a small tin, like it was nothing. Inside was an old key and a folded note with Harper Lane name written carefully. Marlene Lane said she planned this years ago just in case. Harper Lane asked what she was unlocking, and Marlene Lane said the truth. The kettle began to hiss, and Marlene Lane ignored it. She told Harper Lane that Derek Lane anger was not new, but Sloane Lane turned it into a weapon. She said Sloane Lane was patient, and she knew where to press. Harper Lane swallowed and asked why Derek Lane would believe her. Marlene Lane said, "Doubt is easy when a person wants an excuse." Harper Lane felt that land hard, because it sounded true. Marlene Lane slid the key across the table and told Harper Lane to follow her. Harper Lane stood, and her legs felt heavy, yet her mind felt clear. They moved down the hallway, past family photos, past the living room where Derek Lane snored softly. Harper Lane did not look at him, because she did not trust herself to stay calm. Marlene Lane stopped at a small closet, opened the door, and reached behind a stack of blankets. She found a metal box, scratched and old, and she held it like it weighed 100 pounds. Harper Lane felt her pulse climb, and she realized this was the moment. Whatever was inside, it could change everything. Marlene Lane carried the box back to the kitchen and set it on the table. Harper Lane watched her hands and saw them tremble again. Marlene Lane took a slow breath, then used the key. The latch clicked, and the sound felt louder than it should. Inside was a blue shoebox, worn at the corners and wrapped with a ribbon. Marlene Lane said she kept it hidden because she did not trust Sloane Lane. Harper Lane touched the lid and her fingers went cold. She lifted it carefully and saw envelopes, papers, and one small photo. The photo showed Derek Lane holding a baby and Marlene Lane standing beside him. Harper Lane recognized the baby sweater because she had seen it in an old drawer once. Marlene Lane, said Derek Lane, used to brag about that day before he started rewriting it. Harper Lane opened the first envelope and found a letter from her mother. The handwriting was neat and the ink looked faded, but the words felt alive. The letter talked about love, about fear, and about wanting Harper Lane to grow up safe. Harper Lane read slowly, and tears blurred the page, then she wiped them away. Marlene Lane pointed to another packet and told her to read that next. Harper Lane opened it and saw test results, printed and official. The language was clear, and it said Derek Lane was the biological father, with a probability so high it felt absolute. Harper Lane stared and felt her breath catch. Marlene Lane said she paid for the test herself, years ago, when Derek Lane first started accusing. She said she wanted facts, not rumors. Harper Lane asked if Derek Lane knew, and Marlene Lane said no. She said she hoped he would come to his senses, and she did not want to set the house on fire. Harper Lane looked up and asked why she was showing it now. Marlene Lane said because Sloane Lane forced the fire anyway. Harper Lane held the papers tighter and felt anger mixed with relief. She was not crazy, and her mother was not a liar. Marlene Lane reached into the box again and pulled out another envelope, thicker than the rest. She said this one was about the house, and about why Sloane Lane was really smiling. Harper Lane opened the thick envelope, and the paper inside looked like legal forms. Marlene Lane told her it was an addendum, attached to an updated will. Harper Lane read slowly, and her eyes widened as she understood. The house was meant to go to Harper Lane, not to Derek Lane, and not to Sloane Lane. Marlene Lane said she did it to protect Harper Lane's future, because she saw how people change around money. Harper Lane felt a cold wave move through her stomach. She pictured Sloane Lane talking about fairness, and pictured Kinsley Lane soaking up attention, and it started to fit. Marlene Lane, said Sloane Lane, found out there was a will, but she did not know the details. She said Sloane Lane pushed Derek Lane into this scene, hoping Harper Lane would leave in shame. If Harper Lane disappeared, Sloane Lane could argue that Harper Lane should not inherit. Harper Lane clenched her jaw and felt heat rise behind her eyes. She asked how Marlene Lane knew this, and Marlene Lane said she overheard Sloane Lane on the phone. She said Sloane Lane was talking about selling the house and starting fresh, like Marlene Lane memories were a problem to remove. Harper Lane held the papers up and asked if this was enough to stop them. Marlene Lane said it was enough to tell the truth, and it was enough to draw a line. Harper Lane sat back, breathing hard, trying to keep her voice steady. She said Derek Lane humiliated her for nothing, and Marlene Lane said it was not nothing. She said Derek Lane made a choice, and he chose the easiest lie. Harper Lane stared at the blue shoebox, and then at the kitchen doorway. She could hear a creak upstairs, and she knew time was shrinking. Marlene Lane told Harper Lane to take copies, and to keep the originals safe. Harper Lane nodded, and her hands finally stopped shaking. She said she would not vanish, and she would not let Sloane Lane rewrite her family. Marlene Lane squeezed her hand and said they would face it together. Then they heard a soft step in the hallway, and both of them went still. The hallway creaked again, and Harper Lane felt her spine tighten. Sloane Lane appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair loose, robe tied, eyes already awake. She smiled like she owned the room. then looked at the papers on the table. The smile slipped for a second, then returned, sharper. She asked what they were doing up so early, and her tone sounded sweet, yet it carried warning. Marlene Lane stood between Sloane Lane and the box, and said she was having tea with Harper Lane. Sloane Lane stepped closer, and her gaze flicked to the blue shoebox. She asked if Marlene Lane was hiding something, and she laughed softly, like it was a joke. Harper Lane watched her closely, and realized the calm was an act. Sloane Lane's eyes stayed fixed on the table, and her fingers tightened around the edge of the doorway. Harper Lane said they were discussing last night, and she said Derek Lane had no right to say what he said. Sloane Lane shrugged, and said Derek Lane was emotional, and people say wild things when they are hurt. Harper Lane asked hurt by what, and Sloane Lane tilted her head. She said, families have secrets, and sometimes truth comes out ugly. Marlene Lane's voice turned hard, and she said there was no secret, only lies. Sloane Lane's expression cooled, and she asked Marlene Lane if she was calling Derek Lane a liar. Marlene Lane said yes, and she did not look away. Sloane Lane stared at her, then looked at Harper Lane with a slow, measuring glance. She said, Harper Lane should take time and think about leaving things alone. Harper Lane felt anger surge because Sloane Lane was still trying to push her out. Harper Lane said she would not leave, and she would not be erased. Sloane Lane smiled again, thinner now, and said Harper Lane sounded dramatic. Then Sloane Lane turned her head toward the living room and called Derek Lane's name, loud enough to carry. Marlene Lane grabbed Harper Lane's wrist under the table, a silent warning. Harper Lane could hear movement and the faint scrape of a foot on the rug. The house was waking up, and the trap was closing. Derek Lane stumbled into the kitchen, eyes red, shirt wrinkled, anger already loaded. He looked at Harper Lane first, then at Marlene Lane, then at Sloane Lane, as if he needed her to tell him what to feel. Sloane Lane pointed at the table and said, Marlene Lane was hiding documents. Derek Lane stepped closer, and his gaze landed on the test results. Harper Lane saw his face change, fast and ugly. He asked what it was, and Marlene Lane said it was the truth he refused to hear. Derek Lane snatched the top page, and his hands shook as he read. For a moment, his mouth opened like he would speak, then he closed it. Harper Lane watched him process it, and she felt a strange calm. The paper said he was her biological father, and it said it clearly. Derek Lane looked up, and his eyes flicked to Harper Lane, then away. He asked how long Marlene Lane had this, and Marlene Lane said years. Derek Lane's face flushed, and he turned toward Marlene Lane, furious. He said she should have shown him sooner, and Marlene Lane said she tried, but he did not want proof. Sloane Lane stepped in and said tests can be wrong, and papers can be forged. Harper Lane stared at Sloane Lane. Because the denial came too quickly, Marlene Lane demanded Sloane Lane stop, and said she paid for the test herself. Derek Lane looked between them, and his anger searched for a target. Harper Lane, said he, humiliated her in front of strangers, and now he wanted to blame everyone else. Derek Lane snapped that he was betrayed, and Harper Lane said he chose the betrayal. Marlene Lane reached for the blue shoebox and pulled it closer. Derek Lane noticed and asked what else was inside. Marlene Lane said it was not for him to grab. Derek Lane took a step forward, and Harper Lane saw his hands curl. Travis Lane appeared in the doorway, breathless, and asked what was happening. The kitchen filled with tension, and Harper Lane realized this was the real confrontation. Travis Lane moved between Derek Lane and the table and told him to back off. Derek Lane shouted that everyone was against him, and his voice shook with shame. Harper Lane spoke steadily and said the papers proved her mother told the truth. She said Derek Lane tried to destroy her to protect his pride. Derek Lane looked at her, and his eyes softened for half a second, then hardened again. Sloane Lane, said Harper. Lane was manipulating Marlene Lane, and she said Harper Lane wanted the house. Harper Lane almost laughed, because Sloane Lane was confessing without meaning to. Marlene Lane turned on Sloane Lane, and asked why she kept talking about the house. Sloane Lane froze, then recovered and said she was thinking about family security. Marlene Lane, said family. Security did not require pushing Harper Lane out. Harper Lane opened the envelope with the will addendum and held it up. She said she now understood the motive. Sloane Lane's face tightened, and she demanded Harper Lane put it down. Derek Lane grabbed for it, and Travis Lane stopped him. Marlene Lane said the house would go to Harper Lane, and she said she made that decision to protect her. Derek Lane stared, stunned, and Sloane Lane's mouth went tight. Kinsley Lane appeared behind Sloane Lane, eyes wide, and she whispered what was going on. Harper Lane looked at Kinsley Lane and said this was about lies, not about her. Kinsley Lane looked at Sloane Lane, then at Derek Lane, and her face drained. Sloane Lane told Derek Lane they should leave, and she tugged his sleeve. Derek Lane hesitated, torn between anger and embarrassment. Harper Lane said she was done being quiet, and she wanted a public apology, as loud as the accusation. Marlene Lane said she would not allow another scene, and she would call a lawyer if she had to. The kitchen felt too small for the truth, yet the truth was finally in the open. Harper Lane kept the papers in her hands, and her voice stayed steady. She told Derek Lane that proof did not erase what he did. She said the accusation was loud, and the damage was real. Derek Lane rubbed his face and looked at the floor, then at Marlene Lane. He asked why Marlene Lane kept this from him, and Marlene Lane said she tried to protect a child. Travis Lane said Derek Lane did not want truth. He wanted a target. Sloane Lane tried to step in and said everyone should calm down. Harper Lane turned toward Sloane Lane and said, "Calm is not justice." She said Sloane Lane fed this story, and she did it on purpose. Sloane Lane laughed softly, like Harper Lane was being unfair. Harper Lane asked why Sloane Lane kept mentioning the house and why she wanted Harper Lane gone. Kinsley Lane stood behind Sloane Lane, silent and pale. Derek Lane looked confused, and Sloane Lane touched his arm, steering him again. Harper Lane said she wanted an apology, not whispered, not private, but clear. Derek Lane opened his mouth, and nothing came out at first. He said he was sorry, yet the words sounded small. Harper Lane said, "Sorry does not fix humiliation when it was done for an audience." Marlene Lane, said Derek Lane, would not touch the box and she would protect what she promised. Derek Lane flinched at that, like he finally understood he lost trust. Travis Lane told Derek Lane to sit and think before he spoke again. Harper Lane watched Derek Lane's shoulders sink, and she felt no victory. She felt tired, and she felt awake in a new way. She said she would not beg for love or for a place. She said she would set boundaries and she would enforce them. Derek Lane looked up, and his eyes were wet. Then he looked away. Sloane Lane pressed her lips together, and her calm mask started to crack. Sloane Lane tightened her robe belt and took a careful breath. She said Harper Lane was attacking her to distract from Derek Lane pain. Harper Lane answered that Derek Lane pain was not the point. She said a lie was built, and Sloane Lane helped build it. Marlene Lane said she heard Sloane Lane on the phone talking about selling the house. Sloane Lane snapped that Marlene Lane was paranoid and that old people imagine threats. Marlene Lane did not blink and said she was old, not blind. Travis Lane asked Sloane Lane why she pushed Derek Lane so hard, and why she wanted Harper Lane to leave. Sloane Lane looked at Travis Lane with cold irritation, then looked at Derek Lane. She said she wanted fairness, and she wanted security for her family. Harper Lane, said fairness, does not require erasing someone else. Kinsley Lane shifted behind Sloane Lane, and her face tightened with confusion. Harper Lane told Kinsley Lane that she did not blame her, but she would not pretend anymore. Kinsley Lane looked from Harper Lane to Sloane Lane, and her eyes filled. Derek Lane asked Sloane Lane if she knew about the test. Sloane Lane hesitated, just a beat too long, then said no. Marlene Lane, said Sloane. Lane did not need the test, she needed doubt. Derek Lane stared, and his breathing grew rough. Harper Lane saw him realize how he was guided, how he was used. Sloane Lane stepped closer to Derek Lane and tried to soften her voice. She said they should handle this privately and not let Harper Lane control the story. Harper Lane said the story was already public, because Derek Lane made it public. Travis Lane told Sloane Lane to stop spinning, and to tell the truth for once. Sloane Lane eyes flashed, and she said people always choose Harper Lane. Marlene Lane said she chose truth, and she would choose it again. In that moment, Sloane Lane's face hardened, and the sweetness disappeared. Harper Lane gathered the papers and slid them into a folder. She asked Marlene Lane for copies, and Marlene Lane nodded. Travis Lane offered to take photos, and Harper Lane agreed, because she would not risk losing proof. Derek Lane watched, and his shame turned into silence. Harper Lane told him she would not scream, and she would not beg. She said she wanted one thing first, a clear apology in front of the same people. She said he would call them, and he would correct the lie. Derek Lane whispered that he could do it, and his voice shook. Harper Lane said he would also stop drinking around her, or she would leave every time. She said she would not be pulled into another scene. Marlene Lane said the originals would stay locked away, and Sloane Lane would never touch them. Sloane Lane scoffed and said Marlene Lane was turning the family against her. Harper Lane looked at Sloane Lane and said Sloane Lane did that herself. Kinsley Lane stepped forward and asked if her mother really tried to push Harper Lane out. Sloane Lane snapped at Kinsley Lane to stay quiet. Kinsley Lane flinched, and Harper Lane felt a brief ache for her. Harper Lane told Kinsley Lane that lies hurt everyone, even the person who benefits. Travis Lane told Kinsley Lane she deserved honesty too. Derek Lane finally said Sloane Lane had been feeding him fear, and he let it happen. He said he blamed Harper Lane mother because it was easier than facing his own weakness. Harper Lane listened and felt the truth land, heavy but clean. She said she did not need him to be perfect. She needed him to be accountable. Marlene Lane squeezed Harper Lane's hand and said they would protect the future together. Harper Lane looked around the kitchen and realized the power had shifted. The truth was not hiding anymore, and neither was she. The kitchen quieted after the calls, yet tension still hummed in the walls. Kinsley Lane finally asked why her mother kept talking about the house. The question landed like a dropped plate. Sloane Lane snapped that it was not Kinsley Lane business, and Kinsley Lane shrank back. Harper Lane felt a tug of sympathy because Kinsley Lane looked more scared than spoiled in that moment. Travis Lane told Kinsley Lane she deserved honesty, and he looked at Sloane Lane like he dared her to deny it. Marlene Lane said the house was her decision, and she updated her will to protect Harper Lane. Kinsley Lane blinked fast, confused, then hurt. She asked if that meant she would get nothing, and Harper Lane spoke gently. Harper Lane said, "Inheritance is not love, and it is not a trophy." She said, Marlene Lane loved Kinsley Lane, but Marlene Lane was not going to reward manipulation. Sloane Lane stepped forward, voice rising, saying Marlene Lane was punishing her family. Marlene Lane answered that Sloane Lane tried to punish Harper Lane first. Derek Lane rubbed his temples, looking sick, and he asked Sloane Lane if she pushed him into last night. "Sloane Lane," said Derek. Lane was a grown man, and he chose his words. Harper Lane agreed with that, because Derek Lane owned his cruelty. Still, Harper Lane said Sloane Lane planted the doubt, and she did it with purpose. Kinsley Lane looked at Sloane Lane, and her eyes filled. She asked if Sloane Lane knew Harper Lane was Derek Lane's daughter, and Sloane Lane hesitated again. The pause was enough. Derek Lane exhaled hard, like a man realizing he was used. Travis Lane told Sloane Lane to stop acting innocent, because everyone could see the pattern now. Sloane Lane's face hardened, and she said Harper Lane always got what she wanted. Harper Lane answered that she did not want this. She wanted peace, and she wanted respect. Kinsley Lane whispered that she did not want lies anymore, and Marlene Lane reached over and held her hand. That small gesture shifted the room, and Sloane Lane saw it, and her eyes turned sharp. Harper Lane did not stay for comfort, she stayed for accountability. Derek Lane sat at the kitchen table, phone in his hand, staring at the screen like it could bite him. Travis Lane told him to start calling people now. Not later, not after excuses grow. Marlene Lane stood near the sink, watching him like a judge. Sloane Lane paced at the doorway, trying to look bored, yet her eyes kept darting to the folder. Harper Lane told Derek Lane to repeat the truth clearly and without blame. Derek Lane nodded once, then called the first relative. Harper Lane heard him say he was wrong, and he approved. He said Harper Lane was his biological daughter, and he said he lied in anger. His voice cracked, and Harper Lane felt nothing soften. She watched him call again, and again, until his face looked drained. Each call sounded the same, a confession, a correction, a small apology that could not rebuild one shattered night. Sloane Lane tried to interrupt, saying people would gossip and the family image would suffer. Harper Lane answered that the family image already suffered, because Derek Lane made a public scene. Travis Lane told Sloane Lane to stop worrying about the crowd and start worrying about the damage. Kinsley Lane stood in the hallway, listening, hands clasped tight. Harper Lane asked Kinsley Lane to sit, and Kinsley Lane hesitated, then obeyed. Marlene Lane placed tea in front of Harper Lane, and her hand shook less now. Derek Lane finished another call, and looked up at Harper Lane like he wanted mercy. "Harper Lane," said, "mercy comes after change, not before." She said Derek Lane would also apologize to Marlene Lane for ignoring her and attacking her. Derek Lane swallowed, then turned toward Marlene Lane and said he was sorry. Marlene Lane held his gaze and said, "Sorry is a beginning, not a repair." Sloane Lane scoffed, and Derek Lane flinched at the sound. Harper Lane realized the house was learning new rules, and Sloane Lane hated that. Harper Lane stood up, and the movement drew every eye. She told Marlene Lane she would take copies and leave the originals locked away. She told Travis Lane she wanted him present for any future conversations, because witnesses matter. Travis Lane agreed, and Derek Lane nodded, like he finally understood consequences. Harper Lane looked at Derek Lane and said he would not contact her again in anger. She said if he wanted a relationship, he would earn it with steady actions and with sobriety around her. Derek Lane said he understood, and his voice sounded smaller now. Harper Lane turned to Sloane Lane and said she would not fight her for attention or for space. She said Sloane Lane could keep her opinions, but she could not keep control. Sloane Lane laughed once, cold and short, and asked if Harper Lane thought she won. Harper Lane answered that winning was not her goal. She said she wanted the truth on record, and she wanted the lies to stop spreading. Marlene Lane said she would speak with her lawyer and formalize everything clearly. Derek Lane started to protest, then stopped, because he knew he had no ground. Kingsley Lane asked Harper Lane if they could ever be normal, and Harper Lane paused. She said normal might not return, but honest could. She said Kingsley Lane did not have to choose sides. She only had to choose truth. Kingsley Lane nodded and wiped her cheek quickly. Harper Lane gathered her folder and took one slow breath. She told Marlene Lane she would come back later, when the house felt safe again. Marlene Lane hugged her, tight and long, and whispered that she was proud of her. Harper Lane felt the words settle in her chest, warm and solid. She walked to the door, and the morning light hit her face. Behind her, the kitchen stayed quiet, not because everyone agreed, but because everyone finally understood. Harper Lane was not leaving in shame. She was leaving on her terms. Harper Lane drove home with the folder beside her, and the sun finally climbed. Her hands were calm on the steering wheel, yet her mind kept replaying Derek Lane's voice. She remembered the way the room went silent, and the way Sloane Lane's eyes stayed too calm. At home, Harper Lane locked the copies in a drawer and sent scans to Travis Lane. Travis Lane replied fast, saying he saved everything, and he would stand with her if the story twisted again. Harper Lane made coffee and stared at the steam, trying to feel normal. The phone buzzed through the morning. Relatives texting apologies, asking if she was okay. Harper Lane answered politely, but she did not invite anyone in. She understood something now. People will watch a person drown, then offer a towel after. Later, Marlene Lane called, voice stronger than it was the night before. She said she scheduled an appointment with her lawyer, and she said the will addendum would be filed properly. She said Sloane Lane would not be able to argue confusion or claim misunderstanding. Harper Lane thanked her, and Marlene Lane said Harper Lane did not need to thank her for doing what was right. Harper Lane asked how Derek Lane was, and Marlene Lane paused. She said Derek Lane looked broken, but broken is not the same as changed. Harper Lane agreed, and said she would watch actions, not tears. Marlene Lane told her that Sloane Lane was furious, and she blamed Harper Lane for everything. Harper Lane, said Sloane. Lane could blame her if she wanted, but she could not erase her. Marlene Lane, said Travis Lane, would stay close for a while, and the house would not be open to surprise visits. Harper Lane felt relief, and also grief, because safety should not require plans. She looked around her small apartment and realized she had built peace here without them. Now she would protect it. She told Marlene Lane she loved her, and she meant it like a promise. A few days later, Derek Lane asked to meet, and he did not ask through Sloane Lane. He called Harper Lane directly, voice careful, and asked for 10 minutes in a public place. Harper Lane chose a small coffee shop, and she arrived early. Travis Lane sat at a nearby table, not hiding, just present. Derek Lane walked in, looking older than he did at Thanksgiving. He sat down, hands open on the table, and he did not order anything. He said he was sorry, and he said it without excuses this time. Harper Lane listened and did not rush to comfort him. She told him she heard his calls, and she knew he corrected the lie. She said that was required, not heroic. Derek Lane nodded and said he understood. He admitted he let Sloane Lane feed his worst thoughts, because it gave him a target. He admitted he drank too much, and he admitted he enjoyed the power of humiliating her. The honesty stung, yet it mattered. Harper Lane told him the relationship would not return to what it was, and it might never be close. She said she would accept effort, but she would not accept drama. Derek Lane said he started therapy, and he stopped keeping alcohol in the house. Harper Lane said she would believe it when it lasted. She told him Marlene Lane deserved respect, and he owed her more than one apology. Derek Lane agreed, and he promised he would protect Marlene Lane from pressure about the house. Harper Lane watched his face and saw fear there, fear of losing control, fear of consequences. She said consequences were the only teacher he listened to. Travis Lane stood as they ended, and Derek Lane thanked him quietly. Harper Lane walked out, and for the first time she felt the story turning away from chaos. Months passed, and the house stayed standing. Marlene Lane filed everything with her lawyer, and the paperwork was clear. Sloan Lane tried to complain to relatives, but the truth was already out, and it did not bend for her. Kinsley Lane reached out to Harper Lane one evening, sending a simple message. She said she was sorry, and she said she did not understand how bad it was. Harper Lane answered that understanding takes time, and honesty takes courage. They met once quietly and talked like two people who were tired of being used. Harper Lane did not become close with Derek Lane again, but she did accept his steady effort, at a distance. She visited Marlene Lane often, and they rebuilt small routines, tea in the afternoon, old movies, simple laughter that did not feel forced. Harper Lane learned that family is not a title, it is behavior. She learned that blood can be denied, yet truth does not disappear. She learned that boundaries are not punishment, they are protection. When people asked about the Thanksgiving scene, Harper Lane did not perform pain for them. She said the lie was corrected, and she said she moved forward. In private, she kept the copies safe, not because she wanted revenge, but because she respected reality. The message she carried was simple, and it was stronger than any accusation. You do not have to beg for a place at a table where you are treated like nothing. You can stand up, speak clearly, and walk away with your dignity intact. Harper Lane did not win a battle. She reclaimed her name, and she refused to be erased.